To continue further, now when you're trying to write any kind of program or script, basically the main intention, what you're going to do is you are trying to automate something. So automation is the key focus in that way. Now, at some point of time, you might have to pass some values to that particular script or a program. Now, if you take the instance of our Python scripting, now let's say you are trying to write a program where that program needs some variable, and that variable has to be taken from a user. So you can take a simple example where, let's say you are writing a script to automate some task, and to proceed further, if it has to ask the user to proceed further or not, then you can give a option on whether to do it or not. So that way, it is quite important that while you run your Python script or a program, pretty much we should be able to pass some values to it during the runtime. So that is what we call it in the other way as taking the input from the user, and based on that, you will be creating a variable and working as per that. Okay, so that is when, if there is a requirement where during the runtime you want to interact with the user from the script and pass some values. So that specifically, what we can do is use a specific built-in function called raw underscore input. So raw underscore input is a built-in function which Python gives us, using which we can provide a interactive way while the Python script is running. Okay, so at any point of time in between your script, if you use this function, and at that exact point of interpreting when the Python tries to execute it line by line, it will be trying to stop and ask the user to give some value to it. Okay, so that is when, in order to pretty much put a value to the Python script, you will be using this built-in function called raw underscore input. Now, when you say raw underscore input, now by default, it will be taking a value. So that it will be asking us the user to enter. So the syntax, if you see, you will be saying raw underscore input, and in the parenthesis, you will be giving the string which it will be appearing it for the user requesting the value to enter. So whatever the value that you want to enter will be taken by this particular function. But any function that we are trying to work on will return a value. That is what we saw in the last session. So the same way now, when you're trying to ask the user to enter a value through this built-in function, now where is that you're going to store? So what we are going to do for that is, once again, whatever value that we are going to get, pretty much we are going to store it into a variable. So now an example that you can see here, what we have done is, if you give a statement like this, so whenever Python tries to execute the lines one by one, and then it comes here, the first thing that it will do is, if you see a equal, then whatever that you have on the right hand side of the equal will get first evaluated. So that is the default concept that we know. And in that, what is that you have given? You have given a built-in function called raw input. So when you give this, what it is going to do is, whatever the string that you have entered within that, it will try to show this to the user on the runtime and ask him to enter a value. And any value that you enter will be internally stored, and that will be assigned to the variable that you have on the left hand side. So it is like a normal variable assigning is what we are doing, where whatever the value that you get on the right hand side will be assigned to the variable that you have on the left hand side. So now what will happen, as soon as the user enters a value, that will be taken and it will be stored into this variable called str, or whatever variable that you're assigning it to. So that is how you will be doing two tasks together. First thing is taking the input from the user using the raw underscore input, as well as we will be trying to store it into a variable for any future reference that we want to do. And how long the value would be available? So the value would be available until the program execution has completed. Okay, once it completes, the value will not be there, because every time when you run Python, we know that it will be assigning a specific memory for storing all the values. So every time when you run the same script or program, it will ask for the value, and at that point of time, whatever value that you're passing it up, that will be stored in this variable, and it will be available until the program gets completed. Okay. Now, one more thing, what happens if you try to compare with any other scripting like Perl with Python is, whenever you enter a value, pretty much from your command prompt as a user input, now there will be some trailing spaces that will be found in it, or anything that you enter, as soon as you press the enter, there will be a new line character that will be added. So those kind of things will be automatically removed by this raw input function. So raw input function actually does two things. One is it displays this content to the user and asks him to store a value. And then after taking that value, it will be trying to remove whatever the new line character or any space that you have at the end, so that the content that you're going to input to the user will be the exact as you see it. Because if you don't do it, then there will be an additional character at the end, that is the new line character, that will be unnecessarily displayed on the screen, and your output will not be proper. So that is what you are going to do using raw input. So let's just see a simple example to understand that. So let me create a file called, okay, now is the screen visible, or you want me to change the font?
It's visible, Adam.
So you can see now, as soon as we entered the value, it is not going further, and it is waiting for us to give some value to it. And in that, this is the string that we have used to specify under the raw input. So whatever the string that you give here, it is trying to show us as the input location, and it is asking us to take a value. So whatever that values I give here, that will be stored, and internally it will be assigned to that variable called str. And that is how we can store a value during runtime, and you can pretty much use it. Now what will happen is, like I said, you are trying to do some automation, and as part of this you are trying to run many commands and doing some upgrades. So what will happen sometimes, do you want it to just continue blindly, or do you want to take the input from the user, and only if he accepts, go ahead with certain upgrades? So that is when you will have to write a script where it will pause and ask the user to enter some value. So based on that, whatever values that he gives during runtime, that will be stored as a variable. And what kind of variable? A string variable. And then you can store it, and you can use it anytime to compare. So this is one way that you can ensure if there is any conditional match that you want to do during runtime. Okay. Now there are a couple of other built-in functions available, but majorly this function does both the things. That is, whatever string that you are going to try to pass, it will be reading it, as well as remove the new line characters at the end. Okay.
Yeah, Adam.
Kishore, is that clear? Kishore, you there? Okay. Now, so as I was saying, a Python script or a program is needed to do some automation, where we saw how is that you're going to create a variable, and basically how is that you're going to store, do some arithmetic operation or relational check. That is the kind of things that we did. Now, one of the important requirement that we will be using to write a script is basically there will be some kind of log file which you want to parse or read, or you want to put some content into a file. So majorly automation involves working on some log files. So when I say log file, it could be any kind of text formatted file from which you can easily read the content. So that is when on our day-to-day operation activity, if there is a requirement where I have to read some file or I have to put some content into it, whatever that you are doing. So specifically related to the file, if you want to get some data from the file or put some data, then there is a specific way that we are supposed to do. So now, whenever we are trying to work on any file related operation, then the first thing that we need to remember is we have to tell to Python on what is the file that we are trying to work. So that way, first, before we are trying to whether read or write anything to it, you must first open the file. So when I say open the file, it is in terms of the Python where the Python should be internally opening the file to read the content or write the content. Okay, so just like if I ask you, hey, can you go and tell me what is the content of it, you are going to basically open the file and see the content. The same way, if I ask you, can you put some data into it, then you're going to open the file and then add a new line or delete an existing line. The same way, through Python, the first task that we'll be doing when we want to work on some file is to make sure first we open the file. And how is that we are going to open? Once again, for opening a particular file, we will be using a built-in function called open. Okay, so using this built-in function, we will be able to pretty much read or write some content into it. And what will happen internally when you open a file? As soon as you open a file, there will be something called as a file object that will be created. And this will be stored in the Python's memory for that particular run of your program. And what is it going to do? Now, this file object is actually going to act as a link to your content in the file, where using this object, we will be trying to read the content of the file. Okay, so it is going to be actually something like a handler rather than we directly open the file, because what will happen is every time you open a file internally in the operating system level, there will be some system calls which will be done, because of which the input or the output operations will be higher. So that is when what Python is going to do is, instead of opening the file directly, it is going to refer to the file. Okay, so now, yeah, I'm not sure where it got disconnected. So anytime that you try to access a file, first we need to open the file. So that we will use a built-in function called open. Now, as soon as you open, what happens is the Python will not directly go to that file and try to edit the file or modify, because if you're trying to do any kind of such operation on operating system, there will be a lot of input and output operations that is going to happen. So let's say you have a huge file which you're trying to read, then manually if you're trying to read, it will take a lot of memory consumption because of the input and output. Now that is when what Python is going to do is it will use something called as a handler, where that handler is a reference to the content of your file. So basically it will be referring it in terms of the inode of the operating system level. So if you don't understand what is an inode, you can just think of it as this way. Rather than pointing it to directly the content of the file, it is going to refer to the object through which you will be updating the file later. So first, when you open the file, what Python will do is it will try to read the information or get the information from it. And first, you will be interacting with the file object, and only using this file object, we will be further able to exactly do what is the task that you want to do on a file, so that rather than directly putting the changes onto the file or getting the content from it, you will try to use this particular file handler, which is nothing but an object reference. Using that, you will be able to get the content from it. Okay, so first we will open the file, and as soon as we open a file, internally there will be a file object created, which will be acting as a handler for the content of that particular file in our current instance of the Python execution. Okay, and then once you have opened the file and using the file object, you will be telling whether to read the content or write the content into it. And after you have completed your file processing tasks, then you have to close that particular handler or the file object through which you are connected to the file. Okay, so that we will do it using another built-in function called close. So when you say close, what it will happen is whatever the information that the file object has gathered about that particular file, everything will be removed from the memory. Okay, so it is like deconnecting the file between our Python program so that it won't know anything more about it. So first we will open the file, and then as soon as we open the file, we will get a file object being created, and using that as the reference, we will be able to read the content from it or write the content. Okay, and then finally, once we have completed the tasks, whatever that we want to process on a file, then we will close. When we close, it is the open connection or the file object that we have created will be removed in terms of flushing out all the data that you have stored from the file. And when you're using this, there is a syntax that you will use. So the syntax that we're going to use is the file object that will be on your left hand side. Now, instead of the variable, we are going to use the file object. So literally you can consider the file object as something like a variable, but we are not going to use it as a variable because variable is going to store a memory location. Same way, this is also going to store, but the difference is you're going to handle the file line by line using this file object rather than just referring to one particular fixed content like a variable. Using the file object, you will be parsing through the content of the file line by line. Okay, so that is how it acts as a pointer for each line of input or the content that you have in the file. And then to open a file, we will use a function called open, which is built in. And for that, mandatorily, we will be passing two parameters or options. So the first thing is the name of the file which you want to open or for which you want to create a file object later on, based on which you will be trying to read some content or write some content. Okay, so you're just trying to open the file object. Then the next one, what you're going to say is what is the type of the access you want to do to that file. So ideally, now if you take the Linux operating system, what are the kind of modes that we have to work on a file? So pretty much we have three major modes. What and all are they? The first one is read mode. So what you call it as read mode? A read mode is a mode through which we will be able to see the content of the file. Okay, that is what we call it as a read mode. The next one is write mode. A write mode is a mode in which we will be actually adding some content to the file or put some content into the file. But basically what will happen is whenever you are writing some content, you are actually going to overwrite the content on an existing file. So write means you are trying to create a new file and put a content, or you are trying to overwrite the content from an existing file. So that is what generally we mean by write. So that is when if you are not trying to create a new file or you're not trying to overwrite the existing content, the next one that we will see is append, where append is going to additionally add content to a existing file. Okay, so that's the major difference between write and append. Write will overwrite the content, whereas append will try to add the additional content along with the existing content. Okay, so that's the difference between write, and append, or the other ways. These are the three important modes that we have. So specifically in Python, when you want to use that mode, we are going to use some notation. So if you want to open a file only for reading purpose, then you will be giving the access mode as R. The same thing, if you want to open the file only for writing, you don't want to read anything from it, just go ahead and add some data to it. So in that case, now you want to use the W mode, which stands for writing only. Suppose if you want to open the file to read some content from it as well as to input some content to it, then you will simply say R plus. Okay, R plus means it will read the content as well as it will write some content. The same thing, if you want to do reading and writing, you can also use W plus. Okay, so this is exactly the same as R plus, but the difference here is when you use the writing only mode, it is going to be working on a overwriting mode. That means if you do a W plus or an R plus to an existing file, whatever content that you already have will be overwritten with the new content that you're using. So this is equivalent to writing or creating a new file every time you try to open the file. Okay. Whereas if your interest is to actually append on an existing content and not to overwrite, then you will use the mode as A. So for the same, if you want to open the file for reading as well as appending, then you will use A plus. So remember, if you use R plus or W plus, it will be reading the content, but when you're trying to write, whatever the content that you have existing will be overwritten. Okay, so remember, W is write only, which will try to create a file from the beginning if it is not there. But if the file already has some content, then it will be overwritten with the new content what you're trying to write. So for that, we will be using A plus. So depending on what is the kind of situation that we have and what we are trying to do, we will be using a different set of mode. Okay. So like I said, you will be using this file function to do it. But now, as soon as you use this open function, you are just going to create only the file object. And just by the file object, we will not be able to do anything further, because further we have to make use of this file object, and using this file object, we should be doing some tasks. Okay. So the next question comes now is, okay, we are going to use the open built-in function using which we are going to tell to Python on how is that you are going to open the file, whether to read it or whether you are going to write something into it or append. But you're not going to directly do as of now. You're just giving the location on where the file is and what is the file object that it is going to create to refer. So further, in order to use this particular file object to tell whether you want to write something or read something, there is further some specific functions that is associated with the particular file object. Okay, so generally, as soon as we get the file object, using the file object, there are certain methods using which we will be able to read or write a content into the file. So that way, in order to first write the content from it, we will use a function called write. So write method or a function is one where if you put some data to the file, it will use the file object, and with respect to the file object, whatever file that you have referred, it will try to put the content inside it. So now if you try to pass or call this write method, we have to pass a value or an argument, where the argument is nothing but the content that you want to put inside it. So now, how is that you're going to use? So a write function cannot work directly. A write function is associated to a file object. So now what we will do is, an example you can see now, we will first create a open function, and for that open function we will say what is the file name on which we want to work, and then to this file what is the mode that you want to open. So here you can specifically say whether it is a read only or write only. So now if you see, the option that we are going to use is write only, which means I'm not interested to read anything from it, and I'm going to write some content into this file. Okay. And then for this to handle, we are trying to store it on the left hand side, where this is not a variable or a regular variable. Now, since you have used a open function, it is going to create a file object with whatever name that you're giving here. So basically, it is a variable, but a special variable which is going to have a link or a reference to the content of this file. So then, in order to put some content, what you're going to do now is you will say the file object dot the function. What is the function we are trying to do? To put some content into it or to write some content. So that way we will simply say the file object dot and the write function, and within this parenthesis whatever content that you want to put. So what will happen now is, first Python will open this file for writing only mode, and for that it will create a object, and then to this object we are calling a write function and we are giving some value. So what the Python will do is it will take this value and it will write to the file object, where this file object is pointing to this particular file, and in that you have opened for writing only. So it will try to store this content into this file. Okay. So finally, once you have completed all your tasks, you will do a close, wherein when you're calling the close, again, it is associated to this file handler. So simply if you say the file handler or the file object dot the close function, it will stop reading the information from it or writing the information from it based on how you have opened it. Okay. So let's try to execute this. Okay. So here, let me just add some more content. Okay, so you can see this is the earlier program where I'm trying to get a value from the user, and then we are trying to open a file, and then in that you're trying to put. Okay, so now if you try to execute this, so as per the first line, it is going to ask some value, so I can give some value to it, and whatever that you get, it is trying to store, and then it try to execute something. And if you look now, in our current directory, it has actually created a file, because the first thing that the write mode is going to do is, as I said, if you do not have a file, it will try to create a file. So what it does is it will first open the file object, whereas it will not actually create a file at this step, but it is just creating the reference to that file name. And in that, wherever you use this function to write, so this is the content that will be actually stored into this file. So because of which it will create a file in our current directory, and inside the file, if you see, you can see the content of what you have given here. Okay, so this is how, if you want to write some content into it, then you will have to open it in a write mode or in a appending mode. Whereas right now I'm using it for a write function where it is just going to put the data into it. But if you look, I'm opening the file for the write mode. So this is not the same write and this. Try to understand it very clearly. Now, this is the mode which will tell what it has to do for the file. Whereas this write is just for putting the information into the file to store. But based on what you have given, this will be working, which means now if I just say write, it will be writing. But the same thing, if I say append, it is not just going to write, but it is going to add to an existing value. So that's the difference, where write means it will just put into the content of the file. But based on what kind of mode you are using, internally the file handler will be writing. If it is only a write only, then whatever the existing content, it will overwrite or it will create a new file. But if you want to append to an existing, then you have to say a, wherein it will try to add an existing value. Now let me open this file. Okay, now here I'll add some more content. This is a test line. Okay, and let's run the program again. So you can see now the file got overwritten because I had added a line. But what happens is, every time you open a file for write only, then it is going to overwrite the existing content. So pretty much you will be using the write access or write mode only if you are trying to create a new file. Okay, so make sure you're not giving the same file name which is existing, because if it is existing, then it is going to pretty much overwrite the content. So the same thing if you use on appending mode, let's say instead of the write, I'll say the append mode. Okay, now let's open the file. Let me increase the font. Okay, this should be good. So now let me open this file and I'll add. Okay, and now let's try to run this. So you can see now it didn't do anything to the existing content because the program that we had used specified to open a file on an appending mode. So that is how, when you use a appending mode, it is going to put the content, but it is not going to overwrite. This is the existing content. On top of that, it is going to add. So every time you run your program now, it's keep on going to add the value. You can see the next time you add it added another couple of lines. The same thing if now I make it as the write mode, then here it is going to overwrite it. You can see we have this. Let's run the program. So you can see it didn't append, whereas it overwritten that. Okay, so this is how, based on what kind of access that you're going to do, pretty much you will first open the file specifically, and then if your interest is to put some content into it, then you will use the write mode. Okay, same way, if your interest is not to just write the content, but if you want to open the file now for reading some content, okay, so that is when the first task that you will do is you have to tell on what is the mode on which you want to open the file. And then in order to read the content from that particular file, then you have to do two things. The first thing what you have to do is you have to use a built-in function called read, which is associated to that particular the file object that you have created. So now when you're trying to read by using the file object, you have to pass a parameter, and that parameter, whatever you're going to pass, will specify the number of bytes of data that you're going to read from it. So that's how you can specify a limit on, from a file, how much of lines corresponding to the bytes of data that you're going to read from it. So if you have a limitation where you want to say read only a particular amount of data, then pretty much you can use it. If not, what it will do is if you do not specify a limit, then it is going to basically take the entire content of the file and it is going to read it. Okay, so now just like the file object that we have created, if you are trying to read, what is that you're doing? You're trying to read some content from this particular file using the file object that you have created, and in that specifically using this option called read. Now when it is reading, what is it going to do within the program? You are going to get some value from the file, that is some lines of data from that file. So in order for us to use, once again, you have to store that into a variable. Okay, so that is how this example, if you see, the first thing that we have done is we are opening a file with the name of the file and what mode. R plus means we are going to open the file for reading, as well as if I'm interested to write something, I can write. The next thing, in order to read the content from the file, we will use the file object dot read method. And in the bracket here, I'm saying 10. So which represents I want to read only 10 bytes of data from this particular file at a time. And then whatever that 10 bytes of data that you have obtained, where is that you're going to store? So if you give it like this on a equal to, so on the left hand side is a variable, and that will store the content, that is 10 bytes of data that you're going to read from this file. Okay, now if you do not give any number in it, then pretty much it is going to put all the content of the file, that is it will read the entire file and take the content and store into this variable. Okay, so let's try this simply and see how it is going to work. And to this, let me just remove this. Okay, okay, what is it saying? Now, if you see, the file actually has, what is the size of the file? So here you can see the content of the file is quite huge. So that is why the input of data that we are trying to read from the file is only 10 bytes. So for the 10 bytes, it was actually able to read only this much of the content. Okay, so now if you increase that, based on that, whatever the data that it is going to read will be more. Let's say I want to read 50 bytes of data. Now, okay. So you can see based on the data that I'm giving, it is trying to read it. So the same thing now, if I just remove the content of not specifying the range of whatever amount of data I want to take, then what it is going to do? Pretty much it is going to read the entire content from the file and it is going to put. So now everything is stored into one variable. Okay, so that is how at any point of a time you can read the content from a file and you can store it into a variable through the file object. And in case if you have a requirement of reading only a particular amount of data, then you can use this bytes. But if not, generally we'll not be interested to just read only few bytes, because we never know how much of byte is being taken for the line of input that is going to get from the file. So simply we will use the default one by not specifying any value. So what will happen is the Python file object will read the entire content of the file and it will be dumping it into this variable. Okay, getting it on how is that we can read from a file or write a file or append existing file?
Yes, Adam.
So remember, the first thing that we have to do is we have to open the file. So while opening, we will say what is the access mode on which we want to work, whether it is a read only, write, or on the append. And then using the two functions for the file object, that is write or read, we will be specifying whether you want to read some particular content or the whole content of the file, or to put some data into the file. So usually you will be saying the file handler or the file object dot write mode or the file object dot read mode to input some data into the file or to get some content from the file. Getting it?
Yeah, Adam.
Okay, since we are talking about file processing, now there might be some other requirements that we have where you might have to do some file processing, like renaming the file or moving the file or deleting a file. So if you want to do anything while you're running a Python program and change those, then again we have a lot of built-in functions. So that is when we don't have to use the native operating system command to delete it. So if you have a requirement to rename an existing file, then you can use a built-in function called rename. So rename will actually try to take two parameters or arguments. Okay. Now to use this, you will have to first include a module called OS. So OS is a default module which will be having all these built-in functions. So anytime that you're going to use it, first make sure that you're going to import that operating system library or the module, and then you're going to actually say that this is going to act as our object now, because Python is not directly using this. Internally, it is going to work on a object-oriented way. So that is how all these functions, whatever that we are using, is going to be available in this module. So now what we are going to do is we are trying to access the rename module or the rename function available on this parent module called OS. So this is the syntax that we will be doing. And in that, we will be passing two values, where the first value that you are going to pass is what is the current name of the file which you want to change it. And the next one is what is the destination file on which you want to put it as, or this is the source name and this is the destination name. Okay. So based on the name of the file that you give, it will take this particular file and change that file to this particular content. So it is going to be just replacing. Okay. So let's try this. Okay, so what is it saying? So it says that it is not able to do this. That is because I do not have a file called test1.txt. So that is why it is not able to do that. The same thing if I want to change, let me change the source to foo.txt. So this file I have, right? So I have this file. So now if you try to rename, you can see that it didn't give any output, but internally it would have changed it. So now if you see foo.txt, it will not be available. Whereas if you see this file, it will be available because in our program, we have changed the name of the file from foo.txt to test2.txt. So now if you see the content, this is nothing but the same thing what we had for foo. Okay. So make sure when you're trying to rename, the file has to be existing, because only if a file exists, you will be able to rename it. If not, it is going to give us a error saying that it is not able to find that particular file. Okay. Same way, if you want to delete a file, then you will use another built-in function called remove which is based on this OS module. So if you simply say os.remove and give a file name as the parameter, then it is going to delete this particular file. Okay, now let's try the same thing. Now if I just want to delete it, so you can see right now we have the test2 file, but after we run the program, the file would have got deleted. What happened? Okay, spelling mistake. I have given text2. So this is test2. So you can cross check. So I have the file. So now if you try to execute, you can see that that file is not available anymore. Okay, so that's how you can use the built-in function called rename or remove specifically, which will help us to delete a file or rename a file. Okay, getting it?
Yes, Adam.
Kishore? Okay, no problem. Now, that is from the file operations. What if you want to work on a directory? Because what is that you're going to do in a Python program? Pretty much you're going to create a new file and work on a specific directory. So what will happen? By default, when we run Python, it will be trying to create a file or access a file, everything based on our current directory. So any process or a program that you're going to run on Linux will be based on your current working directory. So that way, now, if you want to move from one directory to other directory within the program, how is that you're going to do? Because whatever the task that you're going to run, it is going to basically do everything on our same directory. But in your real-time scenario, if you see, you might have to read a file in a different location. So that's how when you want to move within the program from one directory to other directory or pretty much to access a directory, we will be using different built-in functions. Okay, so that way now there is a built-in function called mkdir. Once again, all of these are part of our default OS module using which we are trying to use the built-in function, which is going to be a replacement for the operating system commands. So that is when if you use mkdir, it is going to create a directory. And where is it going to create? By default on our current working directory or the directory on which the Python program is currently running at that time, which will be by default the present working directory. Unless and until you do not change the directory within your program, the Python will be creating or accessing everything based on your current directory. Okay, so now if you say mkdir, at that point of time where Python program is running, it will be trying to create a directory in that current working directory. Okay, so let's quickly see that. Now, same thing. Let's use this same file. Now, okay, so now what will happen? We are currently working under a directory called /home user. And in this, you can see that there is no folder called test. So now when you run this, it is going to create the test folder in the same directory. Okay. You can see that it has created a directory and it is going to be on the same location from where you have run. The same thing now, instead of executing everything from the same directory or whatever task that you give within your Python program, which will be default running on the current working directory. So if there is a requirement, if you want to change the content from one directory to other directory, then you will use the built-in function called chdir, where if you say os.chdir and give a value that is the name of the directory, then instead of working on the present working directory or current working directory, it will change the program to go to that particular directory and execute all the steps following that. Okay, now same thing. Look what happens if I say this. So what I'll do now is, let me remove this directory called test. So there is no directory called test, right? The same thing, if you go to a temp folder, you can see there is nothing under the temp folder. Okay, now what we will do is, I'll go to the home directory, and in this, let me open up the temp file. Sorry. And in this, before running it, I'll say os.change directory. And in this, we will say as temp. Okay. So what will happen is, now we'll just print that changed the Python to run under temp directory. Okay. And then it is going to run this. So let's just give a simple message so that we will know it has completed. So say created test directory. Okay. So I do not have a test under my home directory or under temp. Okay. So now if you run our Python, so it executed. So first, if you see, you do not have a test directory under your home directory. Then where is it? If you look at the temp folder, you can see it has created, whereas we are still in the same directory. So that is what happens is, when you run your Python program, the change directory is going to tell to the Python that to change from the current directory to this specific directory, and then following that, any activity that it is going to do will be based on this particular directory. So that is how the say ch directory will tell to the Python on which location that you has to run all the subsequent lines of code, and in that, this particular mkdir is going to create a directory. So now we are running from this directory, but inside the program we have changed the directory to temp. So whatever the Python task it is going to do, it is going to do from this particular directory. Hence, this particular test directory is created under the temp folder. So that is how, when you want to change some activities from one directory to other directory and do different kind of automation, you can use the chdar to specifically move around those directories and call that particular application or do some task in terms of automation. Getting it?
Yes, Adam.
Now, the same way, if you want to delete a directory, then simply we will be using the built-in function called rmdir. Okay. So now, once again, rmdir is going to work based on your current directory or the directory on which the program is working. Okay. Now, so let's say os.rmdir, and if you specify this particular one, now let me comment this. Okay, I'm just going to comment. That's it. And now let's run this. So it says that you do not have your directory called test in your current directory. That is why it is giving. But if you change the same thing to your temp folder, then now whatever the program that is going to run will be run based on the temp folder, not on the current directory. So now if you run the same thing, it will not give an error, as well as it will be deleting the test folder from the temp. Getting it?
Yeah.
Any questions so far?
No, Adam.
Kishore? Okay. Now let's see one more topic. So when you're trying to write a script or a program specifically to do some automation, what will happen? You have to do certain activity based on certain options that you want to pass. Now, it is not always that you want the program to be a rigid one and it always does the same activity again and again. Now, if you want to pass some value, and based on that, if you want the program to be behaving it differently, or you want to pass some values during runtime, then what you can do is pretty much you can use something called as a command line argument. Now, what is exactly the command line argument? Now, until now, whatever the program that we ran, we just ran it by calling Python and to that the name of the file. But there is an option where after this script, you can pass some value which will be treated as a parameters to this particular function. Okay, so that is when now this program can take on the online when you're trying to run it on your command line some particular values. Now this is something like a replacement for your raw input. Now what will happen in the raw input is when you're trying to run your program, you're actually stopping the program and asking it to take a value from a user and proceed. So unless and until the user is not going to enter a value, it is going to get stuck there, right? When you're doing some automation, that is not pretty much going to be a handy task. So that is when, rather than taking from the user while program is running, before the program is running, you can pass a value to it, or while calling the program itself, you can pass some values to the program. So based on that, the program will be executing internally. So that way, now, if you want to pass any options or the argument to a particular program, that is a Python program, then you can use the options. Wherein, what you can do is, whatever the values that you pass after your program, the Python will be reading it as a command line argument. But what is that we need? We need to take the value from the command line, because by default, if you pass some value, it will be reading it. Now, regardless of what I'm going to do inside the program, okay, now let's not worry about any of this. So I'm just going to, delete everything. I'm just putting a print statement. That's it. So now if I say Python and I'm just calling it, and to that, if I pass a argument, it is still going to run because it is going to take the value. That's the only thing. But what is the purpose of passing the value or the Python is going to take? Internally, we are going to use it. So that is when, if you are trying to pass an argument to the program through the command line, then what will happen is there is a default variable called sys.argv, okay, where sys.argv is a variable which the Python creates by default, and it stores all the value that whatever we are going to pass to that script during runtime. So while you are invoking the Python script, if you pass any argument, all of them will be stored inside this sys.rv. And sys.rv is not just a regular string variable. It is a list. So what do you mean by list? A list is nothing but a group of elements that we can store. So going back to the basics of variable, the third type of variable is a list, where if you have more than one value that you want to store or element to store, you will use a specific type of a variable called list, right? Wherein you can try to access each one of them separately. So that is how, if you have more than one argument passed, everything will be stored as elements in the sys.rv. Okay, and then the sys.rv will contain all the arguments that you're passing, and along with it, it will also be storing the name of the file which we are trying to call. So simply to understand this, now if you recall the list variable, what is a list? So a list is nothing but it is a group of value that we are going to store, right? For example, if I want to store two values, that is my first name and my second name, and if I want to put some data like this. So now instead of storing a single value into a variable as a string, if we have a requirement of storing more than one elements, then you will be storing it as a list. And how is that you're going to access it now? If you want to access this first, then simply you will say list of that particular index number, right? So this is how we are going to access the values from an element. The same way, now this is the element that you're going to store the values that you are going to hard code. But on the runtime, if you're going to pass any value, then all of them will be stored until a variable called as sys.rv. Whereas sys.rv is going to contain all the arguments that you're going to pass. Okay, so this is how it is going to store. So now in my example, if I called this Python program as test, then the sys.rv will actually contain this data. The same thing if I pass one more value separated by space, then it is going to store it like this. Okay, so that is how we can make use of this default list called sys.rv, and using this we can try to read all the content that we are passing from the command line. Okay, and now once again, when you're using this sys.rv, sys is the module which is the system module which is being given by the Python by default, and in that the specific method or the function that we are using is argv, that is argument, which we are going to access from the command line. Okay, and what is this function? So this is a for loop where, if you once again go back to the basics, what we have said. So when you have a loop to execute, either you can have a loop based on a condition, that is when we will be using a while. But if you have a list of values that you want to execute, then we will be going with the for loop. So now what is this for loop is going to do? This is the name of the variable which is going to be storing all the content of this particular list. So when you put it this way, this is equivalent to saying it like this. So what will happen is internally, this will get replaced with the content whatever you're going to pass, and it will be working. So that now this loop has to go through two elements. So basically it will be running it two times. And in that, every iteration that is going to happen for each value, the value of this variable will be assigned with respect to the element that it is picking up. So that is how a simple for loop where it will be printing all the contents of your sys.rv, which is nothing but the values that you're going to pass through your command line. Okay, so that is how by default any command line arguments that you're going to pass will be stored under this default list, and using a simple loop you can try to print everything. So let's try that.
So if you look now, you're getting three outputs. Why? Because as I said, the sys.argv will also store the name of the file. So it is not exactly these two values. Whatever values that you pass, it will also be taking this as the first element. So the very first element in your sys.rv list will be the name of the file. Okay, so even if you do not pass anything, you can see the default value that it gets stored, or the very first element that it gets stored in the sys.rv will be the name of the file. So if you want to access the value, then you have to start accessing it from the first element, because this is the zeroth element in a list. The next one is the first element, and after that is the second element. So now if I want to access this, I'll be using the first index, whereas if I want to access this, I'll be using the second index. Okay, so that's how any values that you want to pass, you can pretty much use this, and you can try to store the same one. Okay, so whatever values that you're going to pass, that will be stored as sys.argv, and that you can use it as a normal list however you want to access it. Getting it?
Yes, Adam.
Sure. Okay, now there's one final thing that you need to know. That is, so you're going to use Python to open a file, read something, write into it, or pass some argument and do some automation. Now, there's one more thing which you might be interested to do is execute some commands as if you are going to execute it on the operating system. Now, let's say you don't recall any of the functions, how to use it. Then you can use Python to simply execute whatever command that you're giving. Directly, it should be able to run. For example, now I want Python to just help me to run a command ls. Now, how is that you're going to input? Now, if I open any file, okay, and in this, if you just put in ls, it is going to say that there is a syntax error, because it doesn't know anything about this ls, because ls is not a Python command, whereas it is a operating system command. So that is when, if any point of time you have a requirement to call a Linux command directly from the Python, then you're going to use a special module called subprocess. Okay, now earlier versions of Python, there were several OS module that is available called OS system or OS pan or OS popen or commands. Pretty much we were using all those things to do the same activity, but on the latest version, all these things are kind of obsoleted, and we are going to use only one latest module called subprocess. Okay, so what is the subprocess going to do? So basically, it is also a built-in function or a module where it will not only help us to run a command, but you can also do certain advanced tasks like creating a new process for every command that you're going to run. And also, you can try to get the input out of that and store it if it is needed. And also to get the written code of it. Now, if you go to the very basics of Linux, if you have seen in the first class, now I would have told that anything that you run in Python, or sorry, anything that you run on Linux is actually a process only. So internally, if you run a command or a script or whatever, the operating system is going to handle it with reference as a process. And for every command and every script that you're going to run, there will be a process which is created, using which the operating system is going to handle the processing. So that way, now using this process, it'll be a much more effective way of handling your process. It is not just about running the command, but if needed, you can actually handle the process, get the output from it, and also store. So rather than just blindly running, we can capture the output from it, and also we can store, and you can see what is the written status of that execution. Because if I call Python and Python is going to call a operating system command, first thing is you have to execute. Second thing is, do you know whether it executed properly, or if you want to capture the output which that particular command is giving to the Python, that we have to store and put it on our screen. So that way, using this sub process, it is going to help us to do all these three, that is to run the command system commands, or to handle the input or output from that particular command that you're running, as well as what is the exact written status of each process that is going to complete. Because in an operating system, when you're going to run something, it is going to create a process and run everything in there, and after completing every process, it is going to return a status through which the operating system will know whether it has completed it successfully or not. So all these things can be handled using the same module called subprocess. So when you want to use this subprocess, and through that, if you are interested to only run a command, that is just to run a simple OS command, then you will be using a built-in function called call. So you will be saying the module name, which is the subprocess dot the function name, that is call. So when you call this, then it will be trying to run whatever command that you have given inside it. Okay, and then it will return the code or whatever the output that particular command is giving to the Python, that it will be showing it on our screen. Okay, now let's take a simple example and try to run. So when you're including this module, the first thing that we have to do is make sure that in our Python program, we are including this module by saying import. And then we will say subprocess dot a call function. And in that, we will be passing the command, whereas date is the command which will give us the current date in an operating system. So if I run date, I'm going to get this. The same thing, we are going to run it using our Python. Okay, so what has that happened? Now basically, if you look, we are invoking this function, and this function is calling this operating system command as it is, and then whatever the output that it is giving, it is trying to pass it on to the Python, and that is printing. That is what it is doing in terms of returning the code. So whatever the arguments that you pass here, it will be executing it directly, and the output of that, or the written code of that particular command that you have entered, is what we will be seeing it. So the same thing, if I say ls instead of date, so if I say ls in my current directory, this is what the output I'm going to get, right? So same thing if I run the program. Where are you running the program? You are running it on your current directory. So in your current directory, if you do a ls, you will see you will are going to get the same output. Okay, so the system command, whatever that you're running, is getting executed on the same directory. So that is how, using the subprocess module, and in that using the call function, we will be able to run a particular operating system command directly within the program, and that will run on the same directory where you're currently working. Same way, now let's say I don't want to just run the simple command that I have, but if I want to capture the output of whatever I'm running, then you will be using another advanced function called popen, where what this popen will do is it will first execute the command, okay, as it is whatever you're going to give, and then in addition to it, we are also going to capture the output from it as well as the written code. Okay, so that is how now when you use this particular function on this module, you will be passing not only the command, but you will be passing certain other things like what is the process that it has to open, as well as whatever that it is going to capture as a written code, it will be trying to store it into an object. So that is when now using this object, I can try to retrieve what is the complete output rather than printing it directly, because here you can see if you run something, it is directly printing. So instead of printing, if you want to use this inside your Python and do some more further processing, then you can use this, where whatever the output that it is going to get, it is going to put it into these variable called output, or if there is any error, it is going to put it. So that is when you will use this object created by this particular function and store it. So that way, if you run, whatever the output that you're getting is not directly put on the screen, but you are trying to store it into a variable, and that is what you're going to use. So you can use this to parse the data. So let me show you this. What is the difference? So the same thing. Now the difference exactly is, now let's say I'm running ls. Okay. So it is trying to show me all the output. But if you look, the first thing is it is not just printing as the normal ls, but it is trying to take this value and store it into this variable, and that is what we are getting. Now, what I want to do is I want to run a program, and that program should read the number of files in my current directory and give me that output. And the output what I should get from this particular program is, it should clearly say, hey Adam, the number of files in your current directory is so much. So in my case, how many files do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that pretty much I can get it like this. So it is going to give only 8, right? Now, the output what I should get from the program is nothing, but it should clearly just say one line saying the number of files is 8. So how is that you're going to get? So in that case, now, if I use this program and if I simply give this command, what will happen? If I run this, it is not going to take all the value because it is not able to parse. The same thing now, if I use this program, I can pass the values here and I can store the output clearly. And that I can actually get it on our variables. So has these many files. Okay, you see the difference? So rather than just printing whatever I'm running, what we are trying to do is we are trying to capture that particular data, and that I'm trying to store it into a variable, and then I can manipulate any data that I want. So that is how you can use this popen as an advanced option in case if you want to run some command, store the output, as well as take the return status of it and work. If not, if you simply use the call, it will just run the command, and whatever the output the command is going to give, it is going to basically put it on your screen directly. But instead, if you want to capture and store it at some particular variable, then you will be using this advanced option called popen. Getting the difference?
Yes, Adam.
Mm.
Any questions so far?
No.
Now, this is all about the fundamentals of Python. Now, with this fundamentals, you need to think about how is that you're going to write a program to solve some requirement. So let me give you some exercises. Try to think on how is that you can use whatever functions that we saw, whatever ways of calling the variable, loop, condition, everything has to be put together and then you have to solve it. So the simple requirement that what I want you to run is you should print something on the screen which should look like this. Okay. Yeah, Vinay, you can use ls-l, any command. It doesn't matter because call will simply take the argument, which is nothing but the command, whatever you're going to pass. But the difference is if you're passing any value, now ls-l is two options. So when you're using it using the sub process, then you have to basically say it as not directly like this, but you will say ls comma hyphen l. Okay, so this is how you will be passing it. So the requirement what I have is I want you to print it like this. Simple as it, right? So if you can think about how to write it, pretty much all your essentials will be covered in this program. So now what and all you have to use in this, I'll tell you. First thing is you have to use a condition for this. And then before that, you have to create a variable. Okay. And then you will be using a while condition as well as a for loop. So both of them you will be using it. Okay. So now try to use everything in terms of condition and then arithmetic operation. Yeah, that is also you have to do. And you have to do comparison. So all those things you have to do together and get the things done. Okay. So basically when you write your program, simply it should display like this, where you're getting it. First is a star stars 4 times, and then 1 space 3 stars, and then 2 spaces, and then 2 stars, and then 3 spaces 1 star. Okay. Now try to see the logic and let me know if you get stuck somewhere. But pretty much, trust me, if you can write this, that means you would have completed all of your Python, whatever that you have learned on the essentials to put into it. Any question on this?
Yeah, Adam, I'm trying it. Yeah, I'm trying it.